The dining room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet right before something breaks. Derek, my cousin, 31, the kind of guy who says crushing it unironically, top producer 3 years running at the real estate office his father-in-law owns, had a leather notebook in his hand. My notebook. Water-warped at the corner, held shut with a rubber band that had gone brittle years ago. He'd found it in the hall closet while looking for a phone charger, and now he was holding it up over the mashed potatoes like a trophy. She makes up war stories, he said, laughing, looking around the table for backup. I mean, come on. Half this stuff reads like a movie script. I reached for it. My hand actually shook, which embarrassed me more than anything he'd said. 12 place settings, my mother's good china, and every single person at that table looking at me instead of him. That's when my grandfather stood up. Walt, my grandfather, 78, a man who fixed his own truck engine until his hands stopped letting him, didn't stand up for much. Not for Grace, not for toasts, not even for his own birthday cake. He stood up slow, one palm flat on the table like he needed the leverage, and he looked at Derek with an expression I'd never seen on him before. That book is real, he said. I need to back up, because none of that makes sense yet. You need to understand what got us to that table, what was actually in that notebook, and why an old man who never talked about his own war was suddenly the only person in the room willing to talk about mine. My family has always had a very tidy story about who everyone is. Derek was the golden one, not because anybody sat down and decided it, but because he made it easy. Varsity baseball, homecoming court, a business degree he finished in 3.5 years because he wanted to get ahead. By 25 he had his own listings, his own headshots on bus benches, a framed magazine clipping in his mother's front hallway with the headline 30 under 30, real estate's rising stars. My Aunt Carol, Derek's mother, my mother's younger sister, a woman who refers to her son's commission checks the way other people talk about their grandkids' report cards, kept that clipping dusted like it was a saint's relic. Me, I enlisted at 19. Not out of some grand patriotic speech I gave anyone, and not out of desperation either, I just wanted something that would ask more of me than anyone at home ever had. I went in, I did the work, I got picked up for a role that required a security clearance and eventually took me overseas twice. I won't spell out exactly what I did over there. Some of it I still can't. What I can tell you is that it was not decorating open houses with throw pillows. Nobody in my family ever asked what my job actually was. Not once, not in 8 years. At Thanksgiving, Derek would talk for 20 minutes about a bidding war on a 4-bedroom colonial, and everyone would lean in, genuinely engaged, asking follow-up questions like it was riveting. When it was my turn, someone would say, "So are you still doing the army thing?" And before I could answer, the conversation would already be sliding back toward Derek's next listing. My mother, Denise, a warm woman in most rooms, a woman I love, but a woman who has spent 30 years managing conflict by smoothing it over instead of naming it, had a phrase she used whenever I brought it up. Derek's just more relatable, honey. Not everyone can talk about your job at the dinner table. As if the problem was classification levels and not a complete absence of curiosity. I used to keep a mental tally without meaning to, every dinner where Derek got a toast and I got a topic change, every Christmas card that mentioned his big year and reduced mine to "and our other daughter is doing well too." I stopped counting somewhere around year 4, not because it stopped happening, but because counting it wasn't doing anything for me anymore. There was a specific rhythm to it that I only recognized in hindsight. Derek would announce a closing over a text thread the whole family was on, and within the hour there'd be a flurry of exclamation points and a dinner planned around it. I closed out an assignment once that had kept me up nights for 3 straight months, came home for 2 weeks of leave, and the biggest reaction I got was my mother asking if I'd lost weight. Not unkind. Just, pointed somewhere else entirely, the way a compass needle points north whether or not you want it to. I used to try narrowing the gap myself, back when I still thought that was possible. I'd bring home little details, the kind I was allowed to share, a joke from my unit, a description of the mess hall food, something harmless and human. I learned fast that harmless and human wasn't what anyone wanted either. What they wanted, if they wanted anything, was for my life to fit into the same shape as Derek's, measurable, comparable, something you could put a number next to. A career that didn't fit that shape wasn't interesting to them. It was just inconvenient. The one person who never did that to me was my grandfather. Walt didn't ask me 100 questions either, but the ones he asked were different. He'd ask what the weather was like where I was stationed. He'd ask if I was eating enough. Once, out of nowhere, at a gas station while we were pumping gas into his truck, he asked me if the noise ever stopped bothering me, and I understood, even at 22, even without him explaining, that he wasn't asking about traffic. Walt served in Vietnam in a role he never described past logistics, which I now understand is the same kind of shorthand I use myself. He never marched in parades. He never wore a hat with a unit patch on it. But he watched me the way you watch someone you recognize. The night that actually set this whole thing in motion wasn't the dinner with the notebook. It was almost a year earlier, at Carol's 40th wedding anniversary party, a rented hall, a string quartet Carol insisted on even though nobody there liked classical music, 40 people in cocktail attire pretending to enjoy themselves. Derek had brought his fiancée's father, a retired judge, specifically to introduce him around. At some point the judge ended up next to me at the bar and asked, politely, what I did for work. I told him, in the vague, careful way I always did, logistics and coordination, overseas assignments, nothing dramatic. Derek, 3 drinks in, cut across the conversation with a grin. Don't let her be modest, Judge, she basically just does paperwork over there. Real glamorous stuff. He said it like a joke between friends. The judge, a man who'd clearly spent time around people in uniform, a man who actually knew what certain silences meant, looked at me for a second too long, like he could tell I'd just been talked over in front of someone who might have actually understood what I was talking over about. He didn't push it. Neither did I. But something in me finished cracking that night, quiet and total, like ice going under weight it had been holding for years. I stopped trying to explain myself after that. Not out of anger, exactly, more like relief. If nobody was going to ask, I wasn't going to perform an answer nobody wanted. I decided, somewhere on the drive home with my hands tied on the wheel, that I was done narrating my own life for an audience that had already decided the ending. I was going to just keep doing the work. If the truth ever mattered to them, it was going to have to show up on its own, in a form they couldn't argue with. I didn't stop loving my family in that stretch, which surprised me a little, given how angry I was underneath everything. I still called my mother every Sunday. I still sent Derek a text when he closed on his first solo listing without help from his father-in-law, because credit is credit and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just because I was hurt. What I stopped doing was auditioning. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years trying to make people curious about you, and once I put that down, I realized how much of my energy it had actually been taking. I want to be honest about how boring the next part actually was, because it wasn't a plan in any dramatic sense. I just kept a journal. I'd started it years earlier, mostly to keep myself sane during long stretches overseas, mission debriefs stripped of anything classified, notes on the people I served with, small human details that never made it into official paperwork. Dates. Call signs. The exact kind of language that anyone who'd actually served would recognize instantly, and anyone who hadn't would mistake for fiction, because the truth, when you write it down plainly, often reads stranger than something invented. I never showed that notebook to my family. It wasn't a secret, exactly, it just lived in a box in my old closet, and nobody had ever asked what was in it, so I'd never had a reason to bring it out. The one person who knew it existed was Walt. He'd seen me writing in it once, years back, during a visit home between deployments, and instead of asking what it was, he just nodded once, like he was confirming something to himself, and never mentioned it again. Around that time I also did something I'd avoided doing for years, I let my chain of command into my personal life a little. My commanding officer, Colonel Reyes, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd signed off on more of my after-action reports than anyone else on Earth, had mentioned once that she lived only 40 minutes from my hometown. When Derek got engaged and my mother started organizing a family dinner to celebrate, I did something I'd never done in 8 years of service. I invited a colleague from work to a family event. I didn't tell anyone who she was. I just said a friend. Walt was the only one who asked a real question about her, and even then, all he said was, "Someone from your unit?" I told him yes, and he just nodded again. That's the whole strategy, if you can call it one. I stopped hiding the pieces of my life. I let them exist in the same room, for the first time, and I trusted that the truth doesn't need staging when it's actually true. What I didn't expect was that the notebook itself would be the thing that cracked it open, and that it would happen before I'd even said a word. The dinner was at my mother's house, the good china out, 12 places set, Derek's fiancée live-streaming little snippets of the evening for her wedding planning page because apparently pre-wedding family dinners are content now. Colonel Reyes sat near the end of the table, introduced simply as a friend of mine from work, eating pot roast, saying very little, the way people do when they're sizing up a room before they decide whether to speak in it. Derek found the notebook because he went looking for a phone charger in the hall closet and knocked the box down instead. He came back into the dining room holding it, already laughing before he'd even opened it, flipping through pages that weren't his to flip through. He read a line out loud, something about a checkpoint, a call sign, a night that had actually cost me more sleep than I've ever told anyone, and he said it in this exaggerated movie trailer voice, like the whole thing was a screenplay I'd written to make myself sound important. "She makes up war stories," he said, laughing, looking around for backup, and got it, a few uncomfortable chuckles, my Aunt Carol's little exhale that wasn't quite a laugh but wanted to be one. My mother's tight smile that meant please don't make this a thing. I reached for the notebook. My hand shook. And that's when Walt stood up. He didn't raise his voice. That was the strange part, the whole table braced for him too, and instead he just stood there, one hand flat on the tablecloth, and said, quiet and absolutely certain, "That book is real." Derek laughed again, but it came out thinner this time. "Grandpa, come on, it's just..." I said it's real. Walt's voice didn't rise, but something underneath it did. "I know what a field journal looks like, Derek. I kept one myself, a long time ago, before your mother was born. I know the shorthand. I know what it costs somebody to write things down instead of saying them out loud." He looked at me, not at Derek, when he said the next part. "I've seen her writing in that book since she was 22 years old. I never asked what was in it because it wasn't mine to ask. But I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't made up." The table had gone completely silent, the specific silence of people realizing they might have gotten something badly wrong in front of a live-streaming phone propped against the flower centerpiece. Derek opened his mouth to say something else, some half-laugh trying to reclaim the room, and that's when Colonel Reyes set her fork down. "I can confirm that, actually," she said, and something about the flatness of her voice made everyone turn. "I've read parts of that notebook, the unclassified parts, obviously. I'm her commanding officer. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. I signed the paperwork on 2 of the operations referenced in there. I'm not going to get into details at a dinner table, but I'll tell you this much, the events in that book happened, the call signs are real people I've served with, and the woman you just accused of making up war stories has a service record that most people in this room would not be able to sit through hearing in full detail." Carol's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes right before someone starts apologizing too fast. My mother's hand had come up to her mouth. Derek was still holding the notebook, but he wasn't laughing anymore, he was just standing there, looking at the pages like they'd rearranged themselves into a language he suddenly couldn't read. "I didn't," he started. "You didn't ask," I said, and it came out steadier than I expected. 8 years, Derek. Nobody asked. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Somewhere behind us, Derek's fiancée quietly reached over and turned her phone screen face down, which was, honestly, the first genuinely considerate thing anyone had done all evening. Walt sat back down slowly, and under the table, without looking at me, he found my hand and squeezed it once. Colonel Reyes went back to her pot roast like nothing had happened, which somehow made it land even harder. My mother was the one who finally spoke, her voice small in a way I'd never heard it. "I didn't know," she said. "I should have asked." I didn't say it's fine, because it wasn't, not entirely, and I'd promised myself I wasn't going to keep smoothing things over for other people's comfort. I just said, "I know." Derek set the notebook down on the table, careful now, like it might bruise, and slid it back toward me without a word. Nobody made a toast that night. For once, that felt like the right amount of ceremony. Things didn't transform overnight, and I want to be honest about that too, because the tidy version of this story would have everyone crying and hugging by dessert, and that's not what happened. Derek and I didn't have some big cathartic conversation. My mother texted me the next morning, a long message about how sorry she was, how she'd never really understood what I did, how she wanted to do better. I appreciated it. I also didn't pretend 8 years could be undone in a text. What did change was smaller, and steadier. Walt started asking me real questions again, except now other people were in the room when he did, and nobody rushed past my answers to get back to Derek's next listing. My mother asked me, for the first time in my adult life, what my actual job title was, and she wrote it down on a notepad like she was studying for something. Carol never fully warmed up. Some people would rather stay comfortable in their old story than sit with a new one, but she stopped bringing up the 30 under 30 clipping around me, which, honestly, was its own kind of progress. Colonel Reyes became someone I saw at more than just work after that. She'd call sometimes just to check in, and once, months later, she told me she'd been quietly proud of how I handled that dinner, that I hadn't performed my own defense, hadn't begged anyone to believe me, just let the truth stand there and do its own work. I promoted the following spring. There was a small ceremony, nothing flashy, just my unit and a folding table of bad coffee. Walt drove 4 hours to be there. He wore a tie. He didn't say much, but he stood the whole time, the same way he'd stood at that dinner table, like he wanted to make sure everyone could see he was on his feet for this. Afterward, in the parking lot, he told me something he'd never told me before, that he'd kept a notebook too, back in his own service, and that his mother had thrown it away years later while cleaning out a closet, not knowing what it was, just seeing old paper and assuming it was trash. He said he never blamed her for it. She hadn't been given a reason to know better, the same way nobody in my family had ever been given a reason to ask me a real question. That's the thing about people, he said, folding his tie back into his jacket pocket. Most of them aren't cruel. They're just untrained. Somebody has to teach them to look. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone's ever said to me. The people I work with now don't need any of that training. That's the part nobody warns you about beforehand, how strange it feels the first time you're around people who simply already understand, without explanation, what it costs to do this job. I have a small group now, some from my unit, some from Colonel Reyes's old command, people who ask about deployments the way Derek's friends ask about closing costs, casually, easily, like it's just a normal thing to be curious about someone's life. We get dinner sometimes. Nobody's phone is ever propped up against a centerpiece. A few months after that, I got a message from Derek. Short, a little clumsy, clearly written and rewritten a few times before he sent it. He said he'd been thinking about that dinner a lot. He said he was sorry, actually sorry, not the performative kind. He asked if I'd want to grab coffee sometime, just the two of us, no cameras, no live streams. I said maybe, sometime. I meant it, but I also didn't rearrange my whole week to make it happen, and I think, for the first time, he understood why. I still have that notebook. The rubber band finally gave out completely, so now it lives in a proper case, the leather a little softer at the corners than it used to be. I don't hide it anymore, and I don't perform it either. It just sits on my shelf like any other true thing, not asking to be believed, just existing, the same way it always did before anyone bothered to look. People ask me sometimes if I ever went back and read Derek that whole passage he laughed at, made him sit with every word of it. I didn't. I never needed him to understand what it cost me to write it. I just needed him to stop deciding it wasn't real. And in the end, all it took was one old man standing up at a dinner table and telling the truth about a book he'd never even opened. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever had a family that only had room for one story at a time, or a quiet person in your life who turned out to be carrying more than anyone bothered to ask about, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop your story in the comments. Sometimes the people who talk the least have the most worth listening to.